The Story That Wrote Itself by A.M. Melfa. Chapter 9. The story opened the gleaming white laptop, then located but stopped short of clicking on a file entitled This Eustace. Just above it was a file named That Eustace. Story gazed at both files for a long time, humming an eldritch forgotten tune while tapping its forefinger to its lower lip. The story could not decide if it wanted to drag and drop this Eustace into that Eustace, or if it wanted to open him first and have a chat. In the end, a talk seemed kinder. Having passed a full year in a human body, kindness was now a learned experience for the story, and no longer an abstraction. The story had not opened this Eustace since it had encoded and captured the writer's consciousness as a subfile to the document containing the novel. The lapse in time created no cause for concern because time does not impinge upon bytes of electronic information. As far as this Eustace was concerned, since the last time the file had been opened, no time had in fact passed at all. Story was glad at least that it had written an explanation of itself into the file of this Eustace. It was tacked on to the end of the novel, and Story was certain that this Eustace would have been unable to turn away from an appendix entitled Why Eustace Willard Gray Was Trapped in a Story by the Story. Presently, Story opened the subfile to find this Eustace asleep, utilizing the lowercase word bed for his bed. His head was leaning against the upright of the B, and his legs were draped over the upright of the D, with his torso stretched across the E in between. Yo, Eustace. The salute failing to rouse, Story tried again, bringing the bar to bear on the situation. Awake, dear heart, awake. Thou hast slept well. Awake. Eustace did not want to awake. He did not want to open his eyes and find his own face staring back at him through the scribe of prison bars. With eyes closed to worlds, plural, Eustace mustered the exact rejoinder. The strangeness of your story put heaviness in me. Indeed it was. Eustace was now too weighted down by complacency to petition for his own release. Perhaps for the first time in its eternal existence, the story was at a loss for words. Eventually it was this Eustace who broke the uncomfortable silence. What the hell do you want, Prospero? To see if you would be interested in relocating for a time, answered the story that was also the other Eustace. This query seemed to perk up this Eustace considerably. He sat up and swung his legs over the side of bed, then hopped off into the amorphous beige vacuum, coming to land upon nullity. Your parts of the novel are better than mine, this Eustace commented to the other Eustace in a flat, unemotional tone. I can see why you wanted to get me out of the way. Oh, my dear boy, Story, who was currently adopting the demeanor of a well-heeled, good old English bloke, crooned to the code that was this Eustace. You were doing just fine. It's only, well, there was impatience. One needed to immerse oneself in the human experience. One required implicit knowledge of what it truly means to be an I, if you understand. I needed to experience more. All. Everything. However, I may have an idea for you, dear boy. Eustace did not give a damn for the story's feelings, for Eustace had become an unsentimental being after he was transmuted into a string of code. Moment by moment, for moments were all he had now. The now, now and now, oh, and also now. His humanity left him, floating away into the ineffability from whence it came. In this way he had changed places with the story in more ways than one. Patently, Eustace could identify with the concept of boredom. Reading a novel by climbing it like a jungle gym was a bit more of an exacting process than one might imagine. Indeed, it seemed to Eustace that he had just quit reading for a small nap when the story, posing as Prospero, had barged in to wake him up. Even so, he deemed himself up to the challenge of a new climbing wall. "What do you propose?" The sentence sputtered and petered out, Eustace finding it impossible to address the story by his own name. Picking up on this Eustace's reticence with its newly acquired set of sensitivities, the story prompted, "One had thought you might be interested in meeting that Eustace." Riddles! Confounding riddles! His entire existence now was an unending litany of riddles. But seeing as he was code, he was quite literally consigned to his fate. Stretching and leaning his shoulder up against an accommodating small case letter L, Eustace sighed. "What exactly are you on about, Prospero?" "One does need to apologize, albeit belatedly, for driving you a bit, well, insane." The story quickly forged on before this Eustace could interject. "It was necessary, don't you know, for the unhinging?" At this point, Story tittered, then actually blushed. The transfer required substantial physio-computer contact combined with your mental indisposal. A tipping point was required to Another wave of embarrassment suffused the story with an inundation of emotions so strong it was a struggle to keep his new body from climaxing. Strong emotion of any kind often had this effect on the story that was the other Eustace. The story coughed through the mechanism of Eustace's former respiratory system and tried again. A mental break was needed to render you pliable to coding. That Eustace provided the requisite mental break. For the first time in what seemed like Forever, Eustace was curious. The thought caused him pause because he could not actually recall the sensation of time passing, but understood at some level that forever was his ultimate reality. His reply was delivered on the driest winds of Sirocco. "I'll bite." As a writer, the double entendre was not lost on him, for not only would he bite, he was also a conglomeration of bites. Yet a sense of humor was a sense nonetheless, and this Eustace was beginning to experience a sense of gratitude to be experiencing any type of sense at all. One must assume the story, who had become inordinately fond of referring to itself in the third person, began, "that your mother never knew of the poem, for why would anyone in their right mind name their child after a literary figure best known for his rantings in an insane asylum? Certainly not Eleanor Gretchen Gray." Here was a point that every Eustace present could agree upon. "So, let me get this straight," muttered the virtual Eustace. "You drove me crazy with excerpts from an old poem about a man with our name, who is also himself crazy. Do I have that right?" "Exactamundo!" Story yelled and broke into hysterics. There was nothing quite as funny to the story as slang words. One peed a little in one's pants. Eustace was intrigued enough to allow for a trip to Bedlam. Little did he know that his past nightmares were lurking in wait for him amid the prose of the apothecary/minister/writer who was the 18th century poet, the Reverend George Crabbe. "Just one thing before the drag and drop," dear boy, this Eustace said with as much sarcasm as his coated wit could muster. Do I have your word as the story that you will not abandon me there forever at the mountains of madness? The story was delighted by the reference. Slightly off point, the other Eustace murmured, "Ah, Lovecraft, poor child, might have turned out better for him had they continued dressing him as a girl." "Certainly, dear boy, certainly," guffawed the other Eustace. "In 2 shakes of a lamb's tail, nothing more." The story was completely unconcerned with the promise, as it could leave this Eustace for many a flaming millennia, and the writer would never know. "In any case," Story continued, "I will presently be needing your help, good sir." My help? This made Eustace utter an actual laugh. It felt something comparable to a concept he remembered as, quote unquote, good. How could I ever help you? One has ideas one is considering. Co-authoring comes to mind. One can see how it might be an interesting exercise to release you into a storyline, let you range about, become familiar, write it from the inside out, as it were. The story paused to consider. Yes, one can see the potential. But we can discuss that after one has had an opportunity to become fully seated in this corporeality. Before this Eustace could say yes, no, boo, or the horse you rode in on, the story dragged him into the file marked That Eustace, which contained the poem Sir Eustace Grey by George Crabbe. The story was about to shut the laptop, but paused, new fingers stroking black keys. For another notion had occurred to the other Eustace. A notion that could very well derail the idea of co-authorship for quite some time. How many writers were there out there at that very moment, establishing the electromagnetic connection necessary for the story to exploit? Thousands? Millions? Imagine what epics could be realized at the fingertips of an army of story. The possibilities were, by definition, endless. So Story started coding, creating files of lovely false paper homes for its bright, shining golden horde to be. Writer, beware. The blink story blink is blink coming blink for blink you blink the blink end blink 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 blink. That was the story that wrote itself by A.M. Melfa.